Okay, so this is a lecture on sub-Roman Britain. So what is happening sort of after the Romans leave to lay the foundation of what will be eventually sort of English political systems, economic systems, and religious systems. So I'm actually going to kind of back up a little bit to talk about some of the things that happen while Rome's there, because they really do sort of leave this footprint that the people of the island are going to build on. So the sources for this period, especially before the Romans arrive, are really, really limited, particularly the written sources. The Pictic sort of population, I think there's only one actual written document we have of from the entire period that they're sort of active in the north. The other issue with these sources is a lot of them are written by others, sort of particularly the Romans, and then also some of the monks who are in modern day France, who then have some interaction with the population of England, but again aren't sort of writing from the inside. So that obviously is going to skew our perspective. We do have some symbols, some inscriptions, the extent to which these are sort of proto writing, really early systems of writing, is debated by scholars. But there certainly was sort of some recognition that symbols were significant. Obviously, material culture, like this brooch that we have here, gives us a lot of insight into sort of little things about the population, from their sort of ability to work with precious metals, the craftsmanship that this sort of illustrates, as well as the fact that you have at least someone in the population who's wealthy enough that they had this very sort of precious jewel. And it's probably in sort of emulating some of the Roman practices, we do have some stone inscriptions like this. Again, they tell us a little bit about the culture and objects that would have been important to the culture, but leave a lot unknown. So just to sort of recap from last week, pre-Rome or pre-Roman England sort of is divided into these three different cultural groups. So you have the Picts in the north, you have the Scots in what's now Ireland, and then you have the Britons in that sort of main part of England, who are obviously sort of dominating. And then you also have, some movement between these three people, probably quite extensive movement. Um, and what sort of connects these three is they are all Celtic speaking. And they all have sort of a tribal society that they sort of organize into units. These numbers are always really sketchy, but maybe 2 to 3 million inhabitants when the Romans show up. And for the most part, we know that they practice what we call natural religions. I'll talk more about that later, but that sort of distinguishes the distinction there is a natural religion versus a prophetic religion. So Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are examples of sort of prophetic religions. So, what do you have in this place called Britannia? So, eventually, when the Romans first arrive in the first century, they divide the territory up into sort of four different administrative units and assign governors. But then, eventually, as Rome itself sort of reorganizes in the third century, they divide all of the empire up into dioceses. And so a diocese now, if you're Catholic, you're familiar with that term, but that actually was the term first introduced by Rome to talk about an administrative unit. So Britannia is in itself a diocese, and then they divided it up into smaller administrative units called civitates, and they actually sort of based that physical space, those physical divisions, on tribal divisions that they encountered when they first arrived. And in a lot of instances, some of the local population were elevated to positions of authority. Again, numbers sketchy, but about 60,000 Romans probably eventually moved into the region. Most of them are soldiers. I think at its height, Britannia had four Roman legions that it supported. You also have settlers in the form of traders, particularly in larger spaces like Londinium or modern day London. And then Rome also exported officials to sort of help govern. The extent of Roman influence definitely varied across the different regions of Britannia. And I'll talk about that next. So, really, a division of the space into two different places. In part, it's due to the topography of England. So, in the north, you have the Highlands. It's much more mountainous. It was much harder for the Romans to establish permanent control, and so in part, this is why they build Hadrian's Wall and then later the Antonine Wall, just to kind of provide this physical barrier to keep out these invading Pictic populations. This sort of highland area, the military district, was characterized by a very heavy military presence. So that's where the legions were concentrated. It never really established sort of typical Roman features, villas, temples, cities, in part because there just wasn't enough stability. You do have, to the extent that you have sort of civilian settlements, they did sort of congregate around the forts. So this is an image of a fort along Hadrian's Wall. So you have this very, very long wall extending for miles, and then periodically you would have these forts where the Roman soldiers were garrisoned. And some of these are surprisingly well preserved, so we can really get a sense of sort of the barrack life for the Roman soldiers. But then also we know that it's sort of local people gravitated towards these forts primarily because of safety. The closer you were to a fort, the more likely you were to be protected, but also trade opportunities. This also results in sort of intermarriage. So we know, and this is something that scholars have been really just discovering recently, you have a very diverse population in England during this period, because a lot of these Roman soldiers, they're not Italians, they're African, they're from Asia, they're maybe from some of the areas sort of even further to the east. And so they came to England with the army. At this point, a Roman soldier served a 20-year term. So if this is your first stop, that's a really long time. And so a lot of these soldiers intermarried. They interacted with the local population, and then even when their term was up, there was really no incentive to go back to where they were from. So they would establish sort of a permanent residence here. The other sort of division is in the south, and it's sort of called the civil district because it was much more controlled by the Romans, and it had a much heavier Roman settlement. So this is the sort of the central part of England. This is very rich agricultural land. It's sort of a broad, flat expanse, so you don't have the mountains. The mountains are really sort of to the west in Wales and to the north. Primarily agricultural, and was much more Romanized. So if you were to encounter a member of the indigenous population around these areas, they probably would have adopted some Roman customs. Celts were clean shaven, and so were Romans, but Celts tended to wear their hair longer. Romans didn't. So a lot of the local population would have conformed to some of those sort of outward Roman attributes. You also have in this part of England much more of a physical stamp. So baths, such as the baths that are very much intact in Bath. You had temples, you had amphitheaters that the Romans built. You had large villas out in the countryside. So this is where you really would have seen more of that architectural imprint, and that's true of today as well. And so this is much more peaceful, a lot less disruption, so you don't have that heavy military presence. So in the 4th century, we start to see some pretty dramatic indications of decline. And we know that things in Rome, actual Rome, are not good. Things are very bad there. There's an incredible amount of instability in the central part of the empire. And so they're forced to make decisions about where they're going to keep their legions, what they can do and what they can't do as their resources diminish. So gradually, they start to pull the legions out of Britain, and then you see sort of the impact of that sort of vacuum, that military vacuum that's left behind. So we know in 367 there are accounts of what the Romans, obviously, the Romans refer to non-Romans as barbarians, the barbarian conspiracy. So an alliance of Picts, Scots, and Saxons who sort of put pressure on some of the territory that was more Romanized. In part, the people who were Romanized sort of looked to Rome for support, for sort of additional military support, additional resources to fight off these incursions. There was some response. They did build up some forts and try and build up some of the walls along the borders, but they really just did not have the resources to sort of sustain that kind of commitment. So we know by 407, the last legion leaves. And then again, the sources are pretty sketchy on this. Most of the people that lived in this region would have been considered Roman citizens because Rome enfranchised them. So in 410, there is a few accounts of sort of the locals declaring their independence and saying, you know what, we're going to go it alone because you're obviously not in a position to support us anymore. And we've just become too dependent on Rome, and that's made us very vulnerable. So that brings us to sub-Roman Britain. So this is sort of a snapshot of what sort of develops in that vacuum that the Romans leave behind. You have the emergence of dozens of these independent kingdoms. So what happens is sort of wealthy individuals who have the means sort of develop their own private armies because the legions aren't there anymore, and you still have a lot of internal instability, and you also start to have some incursions from the Angles and the Saxons, which we'll focus more on in the future. And so these individuals who sort of rise to the top, they're in a position to collect taxes. They provide protection for the local population, but obviously they're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. So they extract tribute, sometimes forcibly. Sometimes it's sort of consensual. Then these sort of different kingdoms, there's a lot of fluidity here. So there's a lot of internal conflict between kingdoms, but it's not necessarily drawn along ethnic lines. Sometimes there's sort of long-standing feuds or hostilities that fuel this sort of conflict, but a lot of this is conflict because conflict brings resources. When you conquer an area, when you ravage a local land, you collect the spoils of war. A lot of those are tangible in the form of sort of movable wealth, gold, precious metals, slaves. So there is a lot of conflict, but there's also a lot of diplomacy, and much of that happens in the form of intermarriage between these sort of kingly families. Eventually, you have this emergence of a hierarchy, what scholars reference as sort of tiers of authority. So you have overlords then who exact tribute from the person below them, who exacts tribute from the person below them. And in some instances, we even see references to something like a high king, right? So a king who rises to a position, an elite position, who's able to sort of establish his authority even over the other kings in the area. In terms of military tactics, a lot of what we know comes from material culture, so inscriptions or manuscript illuminations or finds like this, which is obviously sort of a helmet, very typical of the period. A lot of the way they fought during this period is still modeled on Rome. So we know that there is a mounted warrior elite, which sort of remains as central to this type of warfare, and particularly because rapid movement that the types of conflict sort of lend themselves to is really essential. They probably fought with swords, spears, and lances. Some of the Pictus tribes maybe fought with axes, but that probably is something that the Vikings introduced and the Angles and the Saxons introduced. And then most of them have rectangular shields and some sort of armor as a sort of protective gear. So in terms of the economy, you're talking about primarily an agricultural economy. This is sort of the mainstay of the area. So growing things depending on the area, like rye, wheat, probably not made into bread, but more into sort of porridges, the kind of things that didn't take a lot of labor. The Romans were big on spelt, but that sort of fades out after they leave. Then they're growing barley primarily so that they can brew ale. And then also things like flax, which then you can use to make linens. So these weren't all things that were immediately consumed, but some of them were grown so that they could be turned into other products. Probably most of these communities lived at a sort of a subsistence level. They were constantly sort of vulnerable to natural disasters. We know that one of the things that happens when Rome pulls out is there's slight climate change. Things get colder around the region, and that causes, that wreaks havoc on a lot of the harvests. Also disease, there's plague during this period in the 5th century in particular. And the way these different kingdoms fight, a lot of the times it's called ravaging. So you just take sort of a small band of warriors into a nearby kingdom, you destroy the land, you enslave the local population, you take anything you can in terms of movable wealth. So those raids would have had a negative impact upon these communities as well. And then what they do produce, a lot of the sort of, the bulk of it goes in tribute that they have to pay in kind to these kings, and then the rest is left for their consumption. One of the things that drew Rome to Britannia in the first place are these rumors that they hear of natural resources. Timber, obviously, because there are a lot of places closer to Rome that don't have sort of the wood needed for construction. Also slaves. This is still a slave-based economy. Agricultural products, we know early on there is a fair amount of agricultural produce that's exported from Britannia when it's part of Rome. Also mining, so copper, lead, and tin, which were useful in terms of sort of farm equipment, military weapons, but compared to other places in the Roman Empire that produce vast quantities of sort of gold and precious jewels, at the end of the day, England was kind of a disappointment in terms of how wealthy it was naturally. So in terms of the population, after Rome pulls out, you no longer have this idea of citizenship and representative government. So you start to see these different parts of the population emerge. So this warrior elite become the nobility. Then below them, you have free peasants. So these would be landowning peasants. So they would be a little bit better off. You have dependent peasants. So these are dependents who sort of rent land or have to pay tribute in return for the land that they cultivate. And then you have a whole sort of part of the population that's enslaved. Many of these slaves are the product of this kind of conquest, but also we do see instances of people becoming enslaved as punishment. And then slaves are sort of part of the merchant economy as well with trade. What you don't have a lot of is you don't have, after Rome, cities really become fairly abandoned. So you don't have that sort of city population of administrative officials. You don't have that sort of city population necessarily of people who specialize in a trade. And so that's going to sort of disappear for quite a while. This is actually an image from a museum in Anglesey in Wales of slave chains. So we know that slaves were commodities, that they were moved across sort of significant expanses of land in the process of this trade. And they're going to be a basic feature of English society until it becomes completely Christian. So then sort of the last thing I want to touch on is religion. So when the Romans first get to England, and for quite a while they're there is, obviously the Romans have their own religion, but what they encounter is a specific type of natural religion. So the distinction that we're making again is between these sort of natural religions, which focus on the everyday. Nature is sort of so central to their survival. And then these prophetic religions that focus more on sort of the soul and on sort of eternal life. They're more focused on what happens next. So these natural religious practices that we see in this region, again, not very well documented. They are polytheistic. So we know that there are lots of gods and goddesses, and they tend to be associated with different places, especially things like springs or hilltops or groves, places where you see this sort of heavy concentration of nature. The purpose of these natural religions was to try and exert control on the natural forces that were sort of so central to survival. So you employ various rituals to sort of control nature, to sort of ensure a positive outcome, whether it's to control disease or to ensure success in battle or to ensure a good harvest. And then you do have these sort of religious specialists. So a lot of the times we think of like a druid class, but they weren't the only ones who would have been active in these religious rituals. So the kings were central. Other individuals would have been active participants as well. This is sort of a Celtic religious shrine that probably would have been the location for a lot of rituals. And then by the 4th century, you start to see Christianity move into the region, in part because it becomes the dominant religion of Rome itself. So Emperor Constantine, who actually starts out as a general in Britain, in 312, he fights sort of a major battle. It's transformative, and he declares that instead of fighting Christianity, Rome is actually going to tolerate Christianity. And this is really pivotal in terms of then the growth of Christianity as sort of a set of beliefs and practices that eventually will reach Britain. Initially, you just see really the elites convert. You have a lot of individuals, especially monks, who sort of travel around and try and spread Christianity. At times, they're welcomed and they have a lot of success. At times, they are not welcomed. And you also see at this point a lot of syncretism. So when they are trying to convert these local populations, they are very generous in terms of expectations. So as I'm sure a lot of people know, there's a lot of overlap between the festivals and the important events in the pre-Christian calendar and what becomes the Christian calendar as a way to encourage people to convert, to make Christianity more familiar to them, and so that it's not such a dramatic departure from their practices before. At this stage, you have two different sort of types of Christianity, and we'll go into this more when we talk about the conversion of Anglo-Saxon England. But you have a practice, and the differences really aren't that distinct, but you have sort of a religious culture that develops in Ireland. And it's more monastic, it's more individual, it's not as sort of tightly connected to the Roman Catholic Church, and particularly the Pope. So you do see a heavy influence from the Irish, right, who come across the ocean there and move into England proper and sort of begin to really spread Christianity. This is when St. Patrick, right, is very active. Patrick isn't Irish at all. He's actually from the north of England. He's enslaved. He's brought to Ireland as a young boy. That's where he converts. That's where he becomes a monk. And then he comes back to England to sort of continue that work of conversion. So this early stage of Christianity, as it spreads across the island, is much more sort of connected to the church in Ireland. That's going to be a struggle later on, and we'll see how that plays out as we move into Anglo-Saxon England.